Thank you for the invitation to give this presentation to IARPC. It's really great as I'm scrolling through the list of participants to see so many colleagues that I haven't seen or talked to in a while. So really appreciate you all logging in to hear about Coast Guard Arctic activities. I'm Candace Knackman. I am the U.S. Coast Guard Senior Ocean Policy and Program Advisor. And I have with me today two of my Polar Coordination Office colleagues who are also going to be presenting with me. So just a quick kind of general run of show. I'm going to begin by introducing you all to the new Coast Guard Polar Coordination Office. I'm then going to turn things over to my colleague, Mr. David Raboy, who's going to give a brief overview of the Coast Guard's new Arctic Strategic Outlook Implementation Plan. And then lastly, we'll hear from Lieutenant Commander Matt Tolliver, who's going to talk about that the Polar Coordination Office is offering a new avenue now for the scientific communities to submit requests for Coast Guard operational support through advocation at the Global Force Management Board. But more about all of that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please, Liz. So as you can see and here on this slide, our new office, we've created a mission statement and a vision statement for ourselves. And so as you see here, our vision is to shape the national and Coast Guard polar policies through diverse stakeholder engagements. And within that, our mission of the Polar Coordination Office is to influence and facilitate unification and continuity of strategic polar policy planning and resourcing. So really what we're talking about here is coordination with a big C. Polar, for us, it was and it still is touching a significant amount of the Coast Guard enterprise. And we were managing these issues based more on relationships. And so our leadership wanted to codify those functions so that they would transcend personal relationships and to clarify roles and responsibilities across the service. And when we say polar, we are talking about touching both poles. So even though presenting today to the Arctic Research Policy Committee, we are talking within our office about both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And so this past July, we met the requirements for initial operating capacity. And you see here in this photo, the 6 inaugural members of our office in a photo with our Vice Commandant, Admiral Poulin, and our Director of Marine Transportation Systems, Mr. Mike Emerson. And so just to kind of quickly introduce you to who we have on the team. So we are led by Captain Chris Webb, who I know is online and I think has his camera on. And so Captain Webb is our office chief and works very hard to keep us in line and to ensure that we are meeting this coordination with a big C here. Standing next to Captain Webb, who's on the far right in the photo, is Mr. Shannon Jenkins, who I think is a familiar name to many of you. Shannon is the Coast Guard's Senior Arctic Policy Advisor and has been filling that role for, I believe, about 5 or 6 years now, really working hard across the Arctic enterprise, both within the Coast Guard and with external partners. I am the senior, as I said, I'm the Senior Ocean Policy Advisor for the Coast Guard and work a lot on Arctic issues, work to be complementary to the issues of the office. But my portfolio actually is much broader and spans a much wider reach than the Arctic or the Antarctic, focusing a lot on climate change, which, as we all know, is affecting the Arctic at 3 to 4 times the rate as the rest of the nation. We also have, third from the right is Commander Sam Blaze. And Commander Blaze is our Polar Mission Planning Coordinator. And he actually right now is serving aboard the Polar Star, which is down in the Antarctic region right now, helping to support science missions down there. And then we also have Mr. David Raboy, who is our Arctic Policy Analyst, and you'll be hearing more from him in a few minutes. as well as Lieutenant Commander Matt Tolliver, who is our Deputy Office Chief, and he will be rounding out our presentation today. So next slide, please. Okay, so I realize that this slide is a bit busy, but it's really here in order to illustrate how our Polar Coordination Office not only fits into the U.S. Coast Guard enterprise, but also the broader reach that we have within our office. So we, as an office, currently reside within the Marine Transportation Systems Directorate. And for those of you who know numbering systems within Coast Guard and DoD, we are 5PW. And we, as the Polar Coordination Office, are the focal point for Coast Guard Polar Affairs, coordinating among the other Polar Enterprise Coast Guard headquarters offices, as well as across the operational areas. So this means that not only are we coordinating within headquarters, but also with our Atlantic and Pacific area commands, as well as District 17, Sector Anchorage, and other applicable units and offices. Our Polar Coordination Office develops Arctic strategy and works to further that strategy through Arctic operations and forums. David will talk a little bit more about the connections between all the different Arctic strategies in a few minutes. And what we do is we seek to maximize effects through operations and messaging. So the Polar Coordination Office, or PCO, coordinates both, as I said, Arctic and Antarctic affairs, and especially these Antarctic affairs, which has a long history of geostrategic importance. And then as you can see kind of along the right side of the slide in the bottom, outside of the Coast Guard, PCO also works with other government agencies, as well as numerous academic, nonprofit, NGOs, think tanks, and foreign allies to advance unity of effort in the Arctic. Next slide, please. So the graphics that you're seeing on this slide are showing some of the tracks from transits that were made this past year by the Coast Guard Cutter Healy. The Polar Coordination Office played a key role in working with others in the planning of the Healy's mission and strategic engagements, and we plan to continue this coordination going forward. This coordination is an example of the focal point that PCO plays in connecting the various offices in the Polar Enterprise and working across, as I said, all of those headquarters, area commands, and other leadership that we have at Coast Guard. One thing that we did over this past year was to help with maximizing strategic engagements with multiple Arctic partners as we move forward. Next slide, please. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this slide because this is a lot of what Matt is going to get into, but this slide, what it really does is that it kind of helps to show the cycling of planning, policy, and resourcing that our office, the PCO, really is playing within the Coast Guard enterprise. And so the steps that are shown here, this is what Matt is going to talk about here in a few minutes. But again, it really highlights our ability to do this level of coordination for the polar regions. All right, next slide. So you're not hallucinating. These are the same photos from slide 4, but I just wanted to put them back up to spend a couple of minutes kind of talking about the science efforts that the Coast Guard helps to facilitate, given that this is the Research Policy Committee that we're presenting at today. And so this past year, Healy's trip demonstrates the Coast Guard's continued commitment to Arctic science and the importance of cooperation and collaboration with Arctic allies through engagements and joint exercises. We are very excited about the Healy's operations that occurred this past year. And it really gave us an opportunity to deepen our cooperation with the international community on search and rescue in the high latitudes, as well as with the scientific community to better understand and act upon the implications of climate change. This was our first time operating, I believe, in the East Siberian and Laptev Seas Laptev Seas north of Russia's EEZ. And in addition to other Arctic science projects, one of the things that Healy did was to service the Nabos moorings in the East Siberian and Laptev Seas north of Russia for the first time, recovering data that will inform the global understanding of a changing Arctic region. So I realized that was a really quick kind of run through and introduction to this new office that the Coast Guard has stood up, but I would like to now turn things over to my colleague, Mr. David Raboy.
Thanks, and we can go to the next slide, please. Next one after that.
Yeah, I know exactly what it is. It's some automatic when they gave me a new.
So in October of last year, the Coast Guard published our Arctic Strategic Outlook implementation plan. It's the first implementation plan under the 2019 Arctic Strategic Outlook. There's quite a number of reasons why it took so long to get to the finish line, but a big part of it was making sure that we were in line with a lot of the recent policy efforts that have taken place both at the national and department level. So the 2022 National Security Strategy, for example, included an entire section on the Arctic for the first time. That was followed by the National Strategy for the Arctic Region, which the Coast Guard helped develop, and we made sure that both the 2019 strategy and our implementation plan were fully aligned with these national strategic documents. Next slide, please. And speaking of strategic documents, there are a lot of them. The Coast Guard has been involved in the development of all of them. And this shows the flow of how we get from national policy down to actually U.S. Coast Guard implementation of U.S. Coast Guard strategy. So we made sure that, like I said, we are fully aligned with both the Coast Guard strategy, DHS strategy, and national strategy. And then you see on the bottom right, the Department of Defense also has its own Arctic strategies and strategies for all the services. We've been involved in the development of those and the upcoming new DoD Arctic strategy, just making sure that all of our efforts are fully aligned. And so we believe that our 2019 Coast Guard Arctic strategy remains relevant. It very clearly advances the 2022 NSAR National Strategy for the Arctic region. And we actually used our implementation plan as input for the NSAR implementation plan. So there's just linkages between all of these various documents to make sure that they align and we're supporting and furthering all the strategies. Next slide, please. And so the ASIP, the Arctic Strategic Outlook Implementation Plan, is made up of 14 initiatives. These are those that you see here. All of these initiatives have multiple action items under them. And this is a public document. Actually, both the 2019 strategy and this implementation plan are available on our website, uscg.mil/Arctic. I believe that's also on a slide in our deck later on, in case you forget that, but we try to keep it easy. And so each of these initiatives not only has action items, but actually has an owner associated with them so that we know who to talk to find out the status of the initiatives. These interconnected initiatives are all meant to action and execute the strategic outlook lines of effort, which are to enhance the capability to operate effectively in the Arctic, to strengthen the rules-based order, and to innovate and adapt to promote resilience and prosperity. And we are working on developing a measurement tool to make sure that we status these initiatives at least annually. We wanted to make all the action items as action-oriented as possible so that we could status them and provide both Coast Guard senior leaders and others with an annual update on how are we doing to advance our strategic outlook and how are we doing to advance national policy. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to call out one because of this community. I thought might be most interested in, one that has to do with Arctic research. And so we have an initiative that is owned by the Coast Guard Research Development and Innovation Governance Council that is co-chaired by our acquisition and requirements directorates. And one of the things that we are planning to do is to create an Arctic research plan that helps prioritize Coast Guard research and development needs. And so I know there's a lot of work that goes on annually to prioritize and pick the projects that we fund. And the Coast Guard is committed to advancing Arctic research and trying to do it in a very thorough and thoughtful way. And to speak more on how we're going to do that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Lieutenant Commander Mike Tolliver, on the ways that the science community can access Coast Guard assets for Arctic research.
All right, thanks everyone. Can I just get a sound check that you can hear me? Thumbs up.
We can hear you.
Thank you so much. If you can go to the next slide, please. And one more. So just remember that term, Global Force Management Board. And before you start going into the slide and focusing on what the words are, I want to talk to you about that we're obviously a new office. We're looking at ways to improve communications between the scientific community and the U.S. Coast Guard. One of the things that we've identified is that there's a limited number of avenues in which the scientific and academic communities can really communicate with us. It has to do with more in the past with personal relationships, and then working through almost exclusively a couple of avenues within the science community like NSF, right, or the universities in order to get time on operational assets. It also is a limited understanding of what our capabilities actually are. So in keeping with that, we wanted to open up an additional avenue for the scientific and academic communities to hopefully work together with us. Mr. Ravoy was able to establish our implementation plan, and that lays out a long list of strategic opportunities that are checklist style items that we're looking to accomplish on our Coast Guard assets. When people think about the Arctic, for even in my community, they normally think of Coast Guard Cutter Healy, right? And that seems to be like a one solution to their needs. Whereas the way I think about it as an operator and an icebreaker sailor, I think of what capability do you need, and then what capability do I have that might get you there, where you may just need support of a TEU or a Connex box, or just sensors. Maybe you just need heavy lift, right? I can do that with a buoy tender that also happens to be ice hardened. And oh, I know that we're going to spend X amount of days in the Arctic with one of those type of assets. Well, maybe whereas you got turned down on the previous avenue, we're bringing in your information, translating it to Coast Guard language, and then we're going to advocate for you when we're allocating hours to the fleet. So, and to explain how this kind of works. So if you see here on the slide, what we're asking for is you to fill out yet another form. But when you fill out this form and you submit it to the Polar Coordination Office, we'll now start establishing a record, right, of what you're looking for. And we're going to try to pair you with the type of capability that we are identifying with. We've got an entire Office of Capabilities and Requirements with CG 751. They establish what our ships are capable of doing and translate a need to matching it to a capability. When we go in front of the board at headquarters, what we're doing is we're saying that there is a demand signal, right, at however much for science. If we keep it on the current way that we're putting folks on an operational asset, and we're only using that avenue as currently designed, then you're getting one voice that goes to one asset or on one or two assets, and we're not distributing it as well as we could. There's no science hours that are allocated to the medium endurance cutter fleet or the buoy tender fleet, right? Different capabilities that may operate in the area that you need. When we allocate those hours and we show that demand signal at the highest levels, then they can pass funded hours back to the area commands. And then the area operational commanders will find a place to fit potentially your request. It's fielding it to a much wider net. So we see this as a net positive. And we're not looking for you to articulate it to Coast Guard language. What we're doing is we've created a form for you, and we've given you a mailbox to send this filled out form. Now, and we will translate it to Coast Guard language and advocate at a board for you, right? And we're also going to be keeping an inventory of things that have been requested and have not been filled. And then if something perhaps maybe falls through that was planned in the operational cycle, we've got a library of requests that we can refer back to. What I'm also going to tell you is that last year we had done a 2-year planning cycle for these global force management boards. We are now planning for the FY26 sales of our assets. I realize that's long in the future, but I don't want that to discourage you from potentially putting a submission for things that you would need in the near future, right? Because what we're trying to do is build a library that's not stepping on the toes or pushing people like NSF who have done great and moved mountains to help communicate with us. In fact, this is meant to supplement that, right? We're going to find things that aren't traditionally on people's radar, that we may have a national security cutter operating in the Arctic region, right? And they have vast capability. If you can go to the next slide for me. There should be one more. This is giving you an idea of talking about those capabilities, right? Do you just need a crane? Do you need, mooring? Do you need multi-beam sonar? Now, there's only so many assets that we have that capability right now, but if it's bolt on, bolt off, if it's helo operations, you fill out the things that you need and describe your operation, and then we'll translate that to our ASIP and find out if we're in alignment strategically. If both of those things are working for you, then we don't necessarily have to worry about if funding's coming from you guys or where it's coming from. We can have a further discussion, right? And it definitely sends a demand signal to senior leaders within the Coast Guard that, hey, this works for us, and maybe it pairs up with R&D, maybe it pairs up with some of the law enforcement folks, maybe it works within our 5PW directorate. We'll help you find that home. Is there one more slide, Candace? I think there's one more. Can we see if there's one more? Yep, that's the one I'm looking for. Okay. Kind of explained it to you. I realize it's a complicated subject. If you'd like me to rephrase or you have a question in particular about what me or any of the other speakers have spoken about, thank you very much for your time, and I'll stand by for questions.
Thank you very much, Matt, Candace, and David. If everyone could give a virtual round of applause to our presenters, very much appreciate all of the information that you have shared with us today. We do now have about half an hour for questions. So you have 2 options for inputting your questions. You can either use the chat. You can do that in the chat so that everyone can see it, or if you've got a question you want to ask anonymously, you can go ahead and chat it directly to me. And if you would like to speak instead, you can do what Larry is doing and raise your hand virtually, and that'll be on your Zoom toolbar under reactions. So Larry, while other people are putting questions in the chat, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. That was a great presentation. I guess first I just want to say that we really do appreciate the contributions and engagement of the Coast Guard in supporting Arctic science, and so that's you've been wonderful for many decades, and we really appreciate that. It's really important to us. And so I've got a question for both Candace and one for Matt, but I'll start with Matt since he was most recent. So I'm just curious with respect to thanks for the information and sharing on as far as enabling access to Coast Guard vessels. Is there an opportunity or an option for utilizing Coast Guard's aircraft facilities? Is that helicopters and for like atmospheric air sampling? Is that a possibility?
Thanks a lot, Larry. Also good to see you again. That's a great question, and this opens up a whole nother avenue where you look at something like DoD, and they have a direct line and representative within our chain of command that advocate for them at the Global Force Management Board. Up to this point, there hasn't been one for the scientific community. We've done our best to advocate, but we haven't had a seat at the table. Now with, and you saw briefly Captain Webb give us a nice smile and wave, he's our primary advocate. We consolidate this information for you. Now, whether it's for a cutter, right, which is the one we are getting used and accustomed to, that people want to get on, say, Healy, we're opening up to other things. So when you say aviation assets, absolutely. And in fact, I had a meeting just yesterday where folks were looking for money and opportunity to test out new unmanned aerial systems. right? And then helicopters, right? They need to do it. So if it's something that's in alignment and you just need the, the environment, or you need the type of asset, you can ask, right? And this sends that signal, right? Which is what we want to send to the board. And so you guys understand that Global Force Management Board is at a senior staff level and low executive directorate that are deciding all the hours for everything. So if there's no demand signal for science, right, then if they do help down the line, it's an unfunded opportunity, right? Which means it drops in priority. If we're going to ask real hard and we show good justification that scientific mission matches Coast Guard mission, then demand signal is high. And now suddenly, where there were 0 hours on an asset, we've got, 200, 300, 400 hours, right? That's paid for through the government taxpayer. We want that, right? We want science to be a big part of the Coast Guard's mission. So that's what we're looking for. So great question. Thank you very much, Larry.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Can I ask my other question to Matt, or I'm sorry, to Candace too, please?
Yes, go ahead.
So Candace, forgive me, I had a telephone call, so I had to slip away for a minute. So if you covered this, just tell me you already mentioned it. But I was curious, when you started out talking, you were talking about the collaboration with the research scientists, but you also mentioned collaborations with foreign allies. And I'm curious, is that with respect to research activities? Does the Coast Guard conduct joint efforts with like the Norwegian research community, or is that the research partnerships, is that strictly with the US community?
Thanks, Larry. I didn't dive deeply into this. So primarily what I was focusing on in my remarks is like joint exercises that we do with partner Coast Guard. So for example, with like the Norwegian Coast Guard. So more kind of on our operational side of things that we do. However, and one of my colleagues on here can jump in if I get this wrong, but I know in the past, I know that there's been like some joint operations, for example, that we've done with the Canadians, and I believe sometimes, when we're supporting, for example, DBO, maybe the St. Laurent is also supporting DBO, but more our engagements there that I was referring to more had to do with operational side of things.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Larry. We've got a question in the chat from Joel asking what the timeline is for more icebreakers.
I'm gonna. You want to take that one, David?
Yeah, I can speak to it quickly. So Polar Security Cutter is going to be our newest class of heavy polar icebreakers, and I think there's been a lot of talk about those. The latest that we have is that we're planning to start construction of the first Polar Security Cutter this year, and it's going to take at least 4 years for that to be done. The more near-term opportunity is the president's budget included funds for a commercial icebreaker, one that's already built and available. We're waiting for Congress to pass, hopefully, a budget to see if those funds make it in there, and then that would be a more near-term action for not a heavy polar icebreaker, but for a Arctic capable asset that potentially could do similar things to the ones that we have, but not the same suite of scientific capabilities that will be on the Polar Security Cutter.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Elena, who is a PhD candidate in social anthropology with experience in Arctic fieldwork. Wondering, would you consider requests for social science or environmental humanities projects? And also, do applicants need to be associated with a university or a nonprofit?
Hey, that's a great question. Similar, when I was presenting a week ago or so with AICC, they had something like that. You not necessarily need to be tied to, right? Everybody knows that if you have mutual interests that are going to cover more than just a singular area, that would make you more competitive. However, you can ask, and it will be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Matt. Did Matt, did you?
I would not
please-
deter you from asking. If you find that it's military and whatever your studies are, I went, you saying my mic doesn't work? What's that? Oh, you can hear me now? Okay, thanks. It's not going to be deterred. I wouldn't deter it in any way, right? But you're not required to be associated.
Thank you, Matt.
Can I get like a thumbs up? I feel like no one can
Yes,
hear
we
me
heard
anymore.
you.
Okay, thanks.
Great. This question may be outside the scope of what y'all can comment on, but we do have a question in the chat about whether there are thoughts or perspectives or potential implications of the devolution work in the agreement that the Canadian government and Nunavut recently entered into.
So I'll just say that I'm not really familiar. I mean, I understand what those words mean, but not familiar with that agreement. And so I don't think we're necessarily best positioned to talk about that. But Liz, maybe that's actually something IARPC as a whole would want to talk about, and Larry could champion that.
Yeah, and I'll drop the one news article that I have read about it so far in the chat, just in case anyone is interested. But I too have read but one article on it so far, so still trying to catch up. Do we have other questions? You can, again, put them in the chat or send them to me if you want to be anonymous, or go ahead and raise your hand. Also, I do notice that we have a couple of folks on the phone. If you would like to chime in or have a question, it's *9 to raise your hand. We have a question from Brian asking if it's possible for U.S. federal agencies to conduct selected piggyback cruises with selected U.S. Coast Guard surface, subsurface platforms, or aerial platforms.
Yeah, so I think that one's for me. Could you expand on that? Cruise, so you want to do piggyback cruises, which sounds like you, right, the difference between like shipwriter program, subsurface, we don't have any subsurface platforms.
Brian, are
We
you
have
able
aerial
to come off
platforms.
mute to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, can you hear me?
You're
I
very
can hear you.
faint.
Very faint?
Okay, a little better now.
Okay, thank you. I'm an oceanographer for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and we've worked with NOAA in the past to do these piggyback cruises, whereas NOAA would take the lead on the cruise. They're the primary users, so to speak. And if available, EPA would occasionally go on board, and while they're doing their work, we would do our work. We did this off the Farallon Islands water disposal site for radioactive waste on the Albatross, and it worked out really well. We also did that with an offshore survey vessel, Bold, that used to belong to the EPA. So in essence, is that the Coast Guard would be the main customer, so to speak, for that cruise. But if there's space and time available, certain things could be done perhaps on physical, chemical, biological, and geological oceanography.
Yeah, no, Brian, thanks for the question. So it's great that you asked that, because that's exactly what we're describing. Now, there's an additional way that you could possibly investigate that, and that would be reaching out to that particular area and looking for a shipwriter program. If you just had something like there's a small project, but this, I would encourage you to submit things like that through us, because then we can show that demand signal again, right? When they're on funded patrols, like one of our ships is already going to be going and being in that area, we can allocate certain hours that are meant that we're not going to be diverting for something else. Like this is dedicated in the plan versus science of opportunity, which means that so long as we don't have other Coast Guard missions being conducted, we'll do the science. We want to dedicate hours and days to science. And doing that on platforms that extend past something like Healy, they don't have planned hours for that. So that's what we're trying to advertise so that we can open more and more frequent opportunities. So
Thank
yes,
you.
we can absolutely do that. And we do that. Yes.
As an example, we were doing deep water trawls to look for radioisotopes in sablefish and Dover sole off of California. And we tried to do those at night so it would not disrupt NOAA's activity. It's just, if it works out well, it's a golden opportunity. These ships are so expensive of having operations 24 hours a day and doing different projects. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks.
While other questions are perhaps coming in, I will pose a question, I believe, to David. Just wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the planned Coast Guard Arctic Research Plan and how you see that working, if at all, with the IARPC Arctic Research Plan, with the Arctic Goals Report, or anything like that, how those will work together.
Sure. So I will answer the question, but not able to directly answer the question. So the role of our office is really to be putting together all the various Arctic initiatives of various stakeholders across the Coast Guard. So this one, for example, is owned by 7 and 9 collectively, not by the Polar Coordination Office. That's true for all of them except for the one initiative that's very clearly the Polar Coordination Office. Having said that, this Arctic research plan is still in its kind of early stages. Not exact. I know that we're trying to like feel our way through what exactly it's going to look like, but for sure would want to make sure that it's linking up with the other research plans, and I know there's a lot of them out there. So and anyone who wants a contact for the people who are going to be working that, I'm happy to provide also.
Thank you. Do we have any additional questions for our speakers? Hearing none, I will ask Candace, David, Matt, do you have anything you'd want to mention that you have not yet?
Just want to, thank you, Liz, and the IARPC team for the invitation and for us to have the ability to share more about ourselves as we, continue our initial operating capacity and working to getting to full strength here within the Coast Guard Polar Coordination. And again, just thanks to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate you wanting to know more about us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for everyone who took their time to listen. The Polar Coordination Office coordination is in the name there, and so our big thing is to be able to be that connective tissue at the Coast Guard. So if there is an Arctic issue question related to the Coast Guard, if we don't have the answer, we can quickly connect you to the people who do. So that's kind of our role. So please feel free to reach out to our office whenever you're looking for Coast Guard equities.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk. Again, still here to answer questions in the future. That's why we're here. We want to advocate for you, and hopefully you're excited about this change, because we are. And have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you again, Candace, David, Matt. I will remind folks that this webinar has been recorded, and so if you missed part of it or you want to send the link to a colleague, we'll have it up on the event page later this week, as well as the IARPC YouTube, and I've just dropped the link to both of those in the chat. We hope to see you soon at a future IARPC Collaborations meeting or webinar, and hope you all have a wonderful day. So thank you again to all of you for joining us and to our speakers.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks all. Thank you.